The cameras were already rolling when Justice Samuel Alito leaned forward, smirked, and said the line that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Congresswoman," he sneered, "this isn't a town hall in the Bronx. Try to act like you belong." The room froze. A few aides chuckled, nervously. The rest held their breath. But AOC didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She simply closed her binder, looked him in the eye, and said, calmly, methodically, "You just made a mistake. A public one." What happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was far more dangerous. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. In the next 7 minutes, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would do something no one expected. She would dismantle a Supreme Court justice's credibility. Not with anger, but with truth. She brought documents, timelines, contradictions, ethics codes, and one piece of evidence so undeniable, so quietly damning, that it made Alito push back his chair, stand up, and walk out of Congress without saying another word. What you're about to see is a dramatized reimagining inspired by real headlines, public figures, and the very real tension between power and accountability. The events are fictional, but the emotions are not. Because in a world where truth often speaks last, sometimes the only way to hear it is to make the room go quiet. It wasn't just a gray morning over the Capitol. It was the kind of sky that feels like it's waiting to crack open. A ceiling of silent clouds stretched over D.C., thick and still, casting everything in silver. But inside the Rayburn House office building, on the second floor, the air wasn't still at all. It was charged. Outside room 2165, the hallway was jammed with reporters and congressional staffers pressing tight against the velvet ropes, all whispering the same question. Why is Alito even here? A Supreme Court justice appearing before the Oversight Committee was rare. Unprecedented, some were saying. The buzz was quiet but electric, like cicadas before a storm. And then he arrived. Justice Samuel Alito, clad in a deep navy suit, stepped out of a black town car with the precision of someone used to never being questioned. Cameras flashed in sync as he walked, chin slightly raised, lips set, jaw sharp. His briefcase was carried not by him, but by a younger aide in a crisp gray suit 2 paces behind. Alito didn't wave. He didn't smile. He didn't even blink as he entered the hallway and walked past the press without slowing. If confidence were a scent, he wore it like cologne. He paused for just a second at the committee door, glanced at the nameplate, oversight and accountability, and muttered something to his aide. No one caught what it was, but his smirk said enough. Inside room 2165 had already begun to fill with members of Congress, staff, and court reporters. The long mahogany table gleamed under cold fluorescent light. Water pitchers were sweating. Name placards lined the curved panel. Every chair was taken, save for 2. One at the center, reserved for Justice Alito. The other was unexpected. A chair on the far left bore a name tag that made several aides blink. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. A pause. A whisper. Wait, AOC? She's not even on this committee anymore. The room shifted. Several heads turned toward the door, and just as someone leaned over to confirm it was a clerical mistake, click. The door opened, and there she was, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, walking in slow and steady like a breeze you don't realize is a storm until the shutters start to shake. No entourage, no phone in hand, just a navy blue binder under her left arm and eyes that didn't scan the room. They measured it. She didn't wave to the press pool. She didn't nod to colleagues. She simply walked down the aisle, heels silent on the thick carpet, and sat down, 3 chairs to the left of the chairman. The aide behind her set nothing on the desk. AOC had come prepared alone. A murmur grew like a wave in the back of the room. Is she subbing in? Is this personal? Does Alito know she's here? This just got interesting. Justice Alito hadn't seen her yet. He was still outside, briefing with 2 staffers and looking mildly bored. Inside, however, the room's energy shifted the way air shifts before thunder. Staffers began closing their laptops. Cameras panned ever so slightly left. A senior clerk on Alito's team stopped mid-sentence, catching her name on the placard. And then, the chairs creaked. Reporters leaned forward. One even whispered to another, "Get ready. This might go viral." And it hadn't even started yet. What no one in that room knew, not yet, was that, in less than 90 minutes, a line would be spoken that would loop on every major network in the country. And it wouldn't come from Alito. It would come from the woman he'd underestimated from the second she walked in. But for now, all they had was silence. The cold, loaded kind. The kind before the lightning hits. She didn't hurry. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked into room 2165 like someone who had already been here 1,000 times in her mind. The heels of her boots made barely a sound on the thick carpet, but somehow everyone still noticed. Her slate gray blazer, slightly oversized, hung over a crisp white blouse. No flashy jewelry, no campaign pin, no need. The only thing in her hands was a weathered navy blue binder, edges worn, tabs sticking out like flags from a battlefield she had studied with purpose. She moved with the calm of someone who'd fought bigger wars than this, just quieter ones. She didn't scan the room the way most politicians did. She didn't acknowledge the murmurs or the turned heads. Her eyes landed on the empty seat at the center of the witness table. And then, for a brief moment, half a breath, no more, they shifted to the door. He wasn't inside yet. Good, 1 second more to settle in, to read the air. And there it was, thick with anticipation, heavy with judgment, and barely masking the curiosity rippling through the rows behind her. She sat down without ceremony, opened her binder, clicked her pen. Nothing dramatic, nothing performative, but the atmosphere reacted anyway. One of Alito's aides leaned in and whispered to another. Someone in the press gallery mouthed, "She's really here?" A C-SPAN intern shifted the angle of the center camera slightly, as if the lens could feel where the real center of gravity had just landed. AOC didn't smile. She rarely did in rooms like this. As she turned to the first page in her binder, her mind flickered, just for a moment, back to the Bronx. The kitchen in their old walk-up on 149th and Brook. Her mother standing by the sink at 6 a.m., hands already chapped from the chemicals she scrubbed with 6 days a week. Her father at the tiny dining table beside her, not yet dressed for work, bent over a sketch pad, carefully outlining the stone columns of the Bronx County Courthouse. That courthouse always fascinated her, not because of what it represented, but because of how much it didn't. Her father used to say, "They built it to look like a cathedral, mija. Not for God, but for power. Just don't forget who they built it against." She didn't, not when the debates got personal. Not when the cameras cut her mid-sentence. Not when they said she was too young, too loud, too dramatic. Not when pundits said with faux admiration, "She's smart, but so polarizing." That word always clung to women who dared to speak with a full voice. She blinked once and looked up, just in time to see him enter. Justice Samuel Alito stepped into the room with the same posture he always had. Erect, distant, completely certain of his place in the American hierarchy. He didn't scan the committee table, just the chairman's chair. Everyone else was noise. He hadn't seen her yet. Not really, not as a threat. That part would come later. AOC didn't move, didn't straighten up, just let her pen hover quietly over the margin of her notes. Her gaze met his for only a second. She didn't blink. He won't see it coming. That's the part that makes it fair. And then she turned back to her notes, silently underlining something on the top of page 2, right where it said disclosure gaps. 2021 to 2023. She didn't need to announce herself. The storm was already in the room. It just hadn't struck yet. The gavel came down with a gentle tap, not forceful, just enough to hush the room. The chairman's voice, smooth and rehearsed, opened the proceedings with the usual procedural language. Words like cooperation, transparency, and constitutional responsibility floated across the room like wallpaper. Decorative, not meant to stick. Justice Alito offered a minimal nod when addressed, eyes half-lidded, fingers folded neatly over each other. It was the body language of someone used to being the final word, not the one answering questions. He didn't show interest. He didn't need to. The first few committee members asked their questions as expected. Measured, courteous, borderline deferential. Could you clarify the intent behind your language in the chamber's decision? Would you agree that the appearance of impartiality is just as important as impartiality itself? Alito responded in clipped, even tones. The record speaks for itself. Interpretation is the domain of judicial reasoning, not media narrative. Ethics are determined by adherence to precedent, not by public sentiment. He wasn't combative. He was dismissive. The kind of dismissive that's harder to fight because it wears a mask of professionalism. Nothing moved the air until the chairman looked down the line, glanced briefly at the seating chart, and said, "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, you may proceed." The shift in the room was subtle, but real. Pens paused. Phones angled higher. One of the reporters near the back raised his eyebrows and mouthed to the camera tech beside him, "Here we go." AOC didn't look up right away. She flipped one page in her binder, clipped her pen to the inside cover, and smoothed the corner of a document with her thumb. When she finally raised her head, her gaze didn't scan the room. It locked directly on Alito. He saw her now, and he smirked. "Let's hope," he said, his voice laced with the condescension of habit. "This isn't another viral audition." A few low chuckles rippled through the room, too soft to be obvious but loud enough to register. Alito leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his arms. It wasn't a full attack. It didn't need to be. Just a jab, a gentle reminder of how she was often portrayed. The headline-grabbing congresswoman, more style than substance, a social media phenom with a flair for drama. AOC didn't flinch. She didn't return the smile. Instead, she opened her binder with deliberate calm and said, "Don't worry, Justice. What I've got here doesn't fit in a soundbite." Her tone was level, not cold, but precise, like a scalpel, not a hammer. And just like that, the rules of engagement shifted. She wasn't here to go viral. She was here to get answers. Not for herself, not even just for the record, but for every single person who'd ever watched hearings like this and wondered if the powerful were ever actually held accountable. This wasn't about volume. It was about pressure. And her first cut had already landed. Clean, quiet, and deep. The silence after her first line lingered longer than expected. Just enough for the weight of her tone to settle into the walls of room 2165. Alito didn't respond right away. He didn't have to. His smirk did the work for him. Thin-lipped, head slightly tilted back, the kind of expression that said he was humoring her. That's what it was, always. A woman like her was to be tolerated, not taken seriously. He leaned back a little farther in his chair, fingers tapping lightly against the side of his armrest. Alexandria didn't break eye contact, but somewhere behind that stillness, her mind drifted, just briefly but sharply, back to a time when she wasn't sitting in rooms like this, when no one would have ever imagined she'd make it this far. Not even her. Especially not them. Her first year in Congress had felt like a dare. She still remembered the early months like bruises, sharp purple moments that hadn't fully faded, the headlines that called her a fluke, the anchors who smirked through their segments about the bartender turned socialist. One cable host referred to her as performance art in a power suit. Another said she'd burn out in a year. Not because of policy, no one even got that far, but because she didn't fit the mold. As if the mold had ever been made for women like her to begin with. She hadn't even gotten her congressional ID when a columnist wrote that her election was a momentary blip of emotion-driven politics. Emotion, they said, like it was an insult. As if reason only belonged to men with graying hair and Harvard degrees. But long before the chamber microphones and the green nameplate, there had been a different room, a much smaller one, in a courthouse in downtown White Plains. She must have been 7 or 8. Her father had brought her along one day while he ran errands. He'd taken a detour, nudged open a side door, and led her into a courtroom. Empty, echoing, heavy with a silence that made her hold her breath. She'd stared up at the judge's bench, impossibly tall, and asked, "Is that where they make the law?" Her father had smiled, that crooked smile of his that always came with something worth remembering. "No," he said, "that's where they remember who it's for." She hadn't fully understood it then. But now, sitting just 30 feet from a man who had spent a career shaping the law like it was a private sculpture, she understood it with painful clarity. Because the law wasn't broken in a single moment. It bent quietly, slowly, each time a voice like hers was laughed off the floor. Each time someone in power decided some people mattered more than others. It bent every time precedent became selective, when ethics became optional, and when answers became polite evasions behind oak panel desks. She came back to the present just in time to hear the soft shuffle of Alito reaching for his water glass. His smirk hadn't moved. His certainty hadn't cracked. Not yet, but it would. Because what he didn't know, what no one in that room had fully grasped, was that this wasn't about showmanship. She didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. She just needed to be the one who didn't flinch when the silence came. And the silence was coming again. She didn't rush. She never did. Alexandria turned one page in her binder, revealing a thick tab marked Hastings v. ROE. The room hadn't settled yet. Too many people still waiting to see if her presence was symbolic. Just another political flair in a high-profile hearing. But that notion faded with her very first question. "Justice Alito," she began, her voice steady, neutral. "In your majority opinion in Hastings versus Roe, you wrote, and I quote, 'The proposed changes to state voting protocol bear no measurable impact on accessibility for disadvantaged populations.' That's page 4, line 7. Is that still your position today?" Alito didn't answer right away. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt beneath his suit sleeve. "Congresswoman," he said with a faint smile, "judicial decisions, as you surely understand, are based on the specific facts and records presented in each case. Generalizations aren't particularly useful here." She nodded once, as if that were an acceptable answer. But it wasn't. Not for her, not for the record. She turned another page, this one already underlined. "Understood," she said. "Let's talk specifics then. The lower court rulings in Hastings both concluded that early voting access dropped disproportionately in minority districts, particularly black majority ones, by over 13%, based on data from the Brennan Center and independent monitors. Yet your opinion dismissed those findings as inconclusive. On what legal basis?" Alito leaned slightly into the mic. "Data interpretation is a matter for trial courts. We review procedural fairness and constitutional alignment. The presence of data doesn't guarantee constitutional relevance." Alexandria tilted her head just slightly, as if curious, but her next move had already been written days ago. "Interesting," she said calmly, "because in your dissent in Klein vs. Dobbs, just 6 months later, you argued the opposite. Page 12, paragraph 2. You criticized the majority for ignoring statistical evidence that showed disparate impact. So in Klein, the numbers mattered. But in Hastings, they didn't." A pause. Alito's lips parted slightly. No sound came out. Behind him, a staffer glanced sideways at a second aide. The clicking of keys from the media row came to a halt. A Republican staffer near the wall leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Not typing, not texting, just watching now. Alexandria continued without missing a beat. "I'm trying to understand, Justice, whether the discrepancy is legal in nature or selective." Alito cleared his throat and leaned back. "Each case carries different thresholds. One mustn't confuse apples and oranges, Congresswoman." "Agreed," she said. "But when it comes to voting rights and constitutional protection, we're not comparing apples and oranges, we're measuring access. And either measurable harm matters or it doesn't. You can't have it both ways without explaining how." Her words weren't angry. There was no edge to her tone. But something in the way she said, "without explaining how," felt like a rope tightening slowly. The silence was heavier now. Not dramatic, just dense. Like the room knew something had shifted, but wasn't quite sure what it meant yet. Alito glanced down at his notes, but his fingers didn't move. His smirk had vanished. AOC turned one more page. "Let's proceed," she said. "There's a pattern I'd like to walk through." And in that moment, even the most seasoned staffers in the chamber began to realize this wasn't grandstanding. It was strategy, and the table was set. The rhythm of the room had settled into an uneasy balance, AOC asking calm, razor-sharp questions, and Alito offering clipped, carefully crafted replies. But the equilibrium was fragile. And somewhere between her third citation and fourth contradiction, it cracked. She had just begun referencing voting irregularities cited in Reed versus Jones when Alito leaned slightly forward, voice quieter than before, but laced with something unmistakable. "This isn't a community board meeting in the Bronx, Congresswoman," he said. "We do things a bit differently here." It was the kind of line that didn't need volume to strike. The insult wasn't loud. It was embedded, calculated, a blend of regional dismissal and professional condescension, and it landed like a stone dropped in the middle of still water. A short, audible gasp came from someone in the gallery, a shuffle of feet. One of the stenographers looked up from her machine, eyes narrowing slightly. On Alito's side of the table, a few aides straightened in their seats, suddenly unsure whether to smile or brace. The air thickened with something unspoken, something ancient, something women like AOC had heard before, in elevators, in interviews, in meetings disguised as meritocracies. Alexandria's pen froze in mid-stroke, not dropped, not snapped, just paused, hovering over the margin of a page she'd already underlined 3 times that morning. Her eyes stayed on her notes for a heartbeat longer, as if measuring the weight of what had just been said. Then she looked up, slowly, deliberately, and met his gaze. "Thank you," she said, voice soft, even, "for reminding me where I came from." A second passed. Her words hung in the air like fog refusing to lift. She didn't blink. "Now," she continued, her voice still controlled, but carrying an unmistakable edge, "let me remind you where you are." The room shifted in an instant. There was no applause, no gasp this time, just silence, dense and total. The kind of silence that feels like someone is holding their breath across an entire building. Even the ambient hum of the overhead lights seemed to recede. A committee member 2 seats down uncrossed his legs without realizing it. The chairman looked up from his notes. Alito didn't speak. He reclined slightly as if reevaluating the conversation, but the smugness in his expression faltered. Just enough for those watching closely to notice. And that's when it changed. AOC turned another page in her binder, but now she wasn't just following a thread of questioning. She was establishing dominance, not by force, but by precision. Her voice didn't rise. Her tone didn't shift into outrage. That would have made it easy to dismiss her as emotional. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, unshaken, unsmiling, unstoppable. She was no longer seeking clarification. She was laying down accountability like evidence on the table. Every word she chose from that moment forward was deliberate. Every document she referenced was part of a larger picture, a story not of individual rulings, but of a pattern, one that was becoming harder and harder for anyone in that room to ignore. The Bronx wasn't something she needed to hide from. It was something she brought with her, on purpose, and now it had a seat at the table. The weight of her last line still lingered in the corners of the room when Alexandria turned to the next section of her binder, the tab marked in red, Precedent Contradictions. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward or narrow her eyes. The power wasn't in performance. It was in precision. "I'd like to walk through 3 rulings," she said, "all written by you, all in the past 22 months. Each involved constitutional interpretation, and in each, precedent was treated differently." She glanced down at the page, her fingers sliding, a printed highlight upward, smooth and practiced. "Let's begin with Hancock versus Rhodes, March of last year. Your majority opinion leaned heavily on the precedent set in Buckley versus Vallejo, citing it as, your words, controlling and unambiguous." Alito nodded, his tone flat. "As it was." AOC looked up. "Then let's move to Turner versus Blake, just 6 months later. Same constitutional clause, same foundational issue, campaign finance disclosures. In your dissent, you stated, and I quote, 'Buckley's application to modern political activity is outdated and insufficiently scoped.'" A beat of silence. Someone near the wall clicked their pen, then immediately stopped. A cough. Nothing else. "You cited Buckley in July," she continued, "but dismissed it 6 months prior. Why?" Alito shifted in his seat. "Each case must be understood in its procedural posture and factual record. Judicial interpretation adapts to context. That's not what you said in Hastings, she replied smoothly, where you wrote, again, your words, precedent's power lies in its consistency, not its convenience. She let the quote hang for just a moment, then added, so I'm asking, which version of you is the court supposed to rely on? Behind Alito, a staffer leaned in, whispering something quickly into the ear of a younger aide. The aide glanced down at a tablet, tapped twice, then looked up again. They weren't passing notes anymore. They were preparing for containment. AOC didn't react to the side activity. Her eyes remained locked on Alito. The role of precedent isn't flexible, she said. It's foundational. When it's cited to serve a conclusion in one ruling and dismissed when inconvenient in another, the issue isn't legal interpretation. It's intellectual honesty. Alito's lips tightened. Congresswoman, you are not a constitutional scholar. No, she said. I'm someone who reads footnotes. Thoroughly. She tapped her binder lightly. And yours tell a story, Justice, one the public deserves to understand. There was something relentless about the way she continued, not aggressive, but steady, a pressure that didn't let up. Like water against rock, quiet, certain, over time impossible to ignore. She flipped to the next page. Bennett v. Texas. In your majority opinion, you built an argument based on Citizens United, but omitted McConnell v. FEC, which was far more directly applicable to the structure of the case. Why leave it out? Alito blinked. The court is not required to cite every related ruling in a given opinion. No, she agreed. Just the ones that don't contradict your outcome? That line hit harder than anything else so far, not because she shouted it, but because of how quietly she delivered it, like it wasn't an accusation, but a diagnosis. She leaned back slightly and closed the section of her binder. These aren't oversights, Justice. They're choices, and they raise a question bigger than any individual case. She paused, letting the silence stretch again. What happens when precedent becomes a tool for power instead of a shield for fairness? No one answered, because in that moment, even the people who wanted to defend him weren't sure they could. The room hadn't shifted back to neutral, not after that last question. Alexandria could feel it, the change in posture from committee members, the stillness from the press row, even the slight pause from the court stenographer between strokes. The moment was hers now, but she wasn't interested in theatrical domination. She was building something slower, heavier, a chain of accountability that would be too strong to unhook, one link at a time. She flipped to a section in her binder marked Access Disparities, the tab worn from repeated handling. Justice Alito, she began again, let's turn to the case of Hastings versus Roe. Her voice was measured as if she were back in her high school debate team, building an argument brick by brick. In that opinion, your majority ruling concluded that the changes in voting laws pose, quote, no measurable impact on access. He nodded without hesitation. Correct. She looked down briefly. Yet the Brennan Center for Justice released a report 3 weeks later. It cited a 14% decline in early voting participation among Black voters in the impacted district. The same data was submitted into the trial record by plaintiffs. And yet, your ruling made no mention of it. Why? Alito responded smoothly, but there was an edge creeping into his tone. Statistical fluctuation is not evidence of unconstitutional burden. Courts must weigh patterns, not outliers. She didn't look away. 14% is not an outlier, it's a signal, one loud enough to be heard by anyone willing to listen. He shifted. Congresswoman, anecdotal data. It wasn't anecdotal, she cut in, still calm, still steady. It came from a sample size of over 200,000 registered voters, cross-verified by 2 independent academic reviews. So let me ask again, was the issue the data itself or the people behind it? The line didn't echo. It didn't need to. It landed silently, like something heavy placed carefully on a glass table. Alito didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, barely. One of his aides leaned forward, perhaps ready to intervene, but then thought better of it. A single click came from a ballpoint pen in the back row, followed by silence again. Alexandria leaned forward just slightly, but not enough to look aggressive, just enough to look unshaken. Because when you dismiss hard data about disenfranchisement in communities of color, while claiming neutrality, it invites a question I think a lot of Americans are quietly asking. Whose access are we protecting? Whose burden do we choose to recognize? Alito's voice came back cooler now, clipped. My role is not to favor demographics, but to interpret constitutional thresholds. That's fair, she replied, but thresholds don't exist in vacuums. They exist in neighborhoods, in districts where polling places disappear overnight, in counties where the rules change faster than voters can adjust. Those aren't theories, Justice. They're realities. And when your rulings erase those realities, it feels like the court is doing something it was never meant to do, refereeing democracy from above without looking at the ground. There was a weight to her words now, not rhetorical flair, but lived experience. She wasn't speaking for applause. She was speaking for the people whose names never made it into footnotes, whose voices didn't echo inside marble halls. You say there's no measurable impact, she continued, but maybe the problem isn't the impact. Maybe it's that you're measuring the wrong things. This time, Alito had no response. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was indicting. Because in that moment, the burden of proof didn't sit with her. It sat with him, and everyone in the room knew it. Alexandria didn't wait for Alito to recover from the silence she'd left hanging. She turned the page again, this one printed on thicker paper, with color-coded columns and footnotes packed tight at the bottom. Her index finger followed a bolded header as she spoke, her tone now shifting ever so slightly. Still composed, but with an unmistakable edge of urgency sharpening each word. Let's move to ethics, she said, specifically the intersection between your rulings and your personal engagements with private donors. Alito glanced at the document she held, then back at her. For the first time, his eyes lingered, not dismissive, not amused, focused. In the past 3 years, she continued, you've delivered keynote addresses at 12 separate events hosted by political advocacy groups. Of those 12, at least 7 were sponsored, either publicly or through PAC extensions, by organizations that later filed amicus briefs in cases you presided over. Not once in any of those cases did you recuse yourself. She turned to the next sheet, a timeline stretching across 3 pages, carefully color-coded. Here, for example, March 12th, you appeared at the Jefferson Policy Conference, which received funding from the Citizens Growth Coalition. 3 weeks later, in Turner versus Blake, you ruled in favor of their position, despite having been personally hosted by them at a closed-door roundtable dinner. Alito adjusted his glasses. Those events are educational in nature. I have no control over who attends. She didn't blink. But you accepted private travel, a chauffeured vehicle, catering services, and you listed none of it on your annual disclosure. That makes it more than educational, Justice. That makes it relevant. A few feet behind Alito, one of his aides stiffened. The other began typing furiously, face tense. And then, AOC went on, voice still even, but increasingly unrelenting. There's your speech at the Scalia Freedom Dinner. She opened a clipped transcript, highlighted in 2 shades. You said, and I quote, "This country is in trouble because Congress doesn't understand the separation of powers." A murmur ran through the gallery, soft, uncertain, but present. Alito leaned in, hands clasped. That quote is out of context. Alexandria looked up, eyes narrowing just slightly. Then let's give it context. She held up the full transcript. You were asked about recent legislation limiting judicial discretion. You responded, and I quote again, "Elected officials today lack the temperament and training to legislate responsibly. The judiciary must act as a stabilizing force, whether they like it or not." He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. So help me understand, she said. When you speak to donors, you frame the court as a check against Congress. When you rule from the bench, you frame Congress as irrelevant. When you decline to disclose gifts, you claim no influence. When your decisions align with the interests of your hosts, you cite coincidence. Then she leaned forward slightly, her voice firmer now, her pace just a bit slower. You don't just interpret the law, sir. You steer it. That line landed with a dull thud, quiet, but final. Not dramatic, just undeniable. The kind of truth that doesn't shout because it doesn't need to. Across the room, someone exhaled audibly, not because they were surprised, but because she'd finally said what many had only thought, and because once said, it couldn't be unsaid. Alexandria didn't bother glancing at the clock. Time had become secondary. The chamber had fully bent to her rhythm now. She could feel it in the stillness of the room, the way even Alito's supporters had stopped shifting in their seats. No one interrupted. No one dared to. She flipped to the next section of her binder, this one thinner but printed on heavier paper. A single word appeared in bold across the tab. Travel. Let's step away from the courtroom for a moment, she said, not asking for permission. Let's talk about your trip on June 17th of last year. Alito raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She held up a page for the record. According to publicly available FAA flight logs, on that date, you boarded a Gulfstream G450 registered to Westmore Holdings. That company is owned by Paul Brenner, a major contributor to the American Accountability Fund. She flipped the page, calm as ever. The same fund that filed amicus briefs in Caldwell v. Simmons and Reed v. United Trust, both of which were decided in your chamber, both of which aligned with Brenner's policy objectives. Alito exhaled softly through his nose. That engagement was personal, a long-standing invitation extended between families. AOC looked at him, no change in expression. Did you report it? He shifted in his seat. It was not required. The Judicial Conference has guidelines for personal hospitality exemptions. She didn't nod. She didn't challenge him directly. Instead, she turned to the next document in her folder, a color printout of a Westmore Holdings press release, dated one day after the trip. In that case, she said evenly, can you explain why the company's own statement described the event as a policy roundtable? And why it named you, formally, as a featured guest representing judicial expertise? Alito glanced toward his aides. One of them leaned in, whispered something quickly. His lips pressed into a tighter line. Alexandria didn't wait. And if it was so personal, why were 4 additional passengers on that plane listed as senior counsel for advocacy groups directly involved in pending litigation? Alito began to answer, then stopped. His fingers curled slightly on the table. To the public, AOC continued, her voice just above a whisper now, it doesn't look like friendship. It doesn't even look like access. She paused, letting the next words land with purpose. It looks like purchase. No gasp, no murmur, just silence, dense and cold like glass before it shatters. Alito straightened his shoulders. I do not engage in quid pro quo. My judicial integrity is intact. She didn't smile. Judicial integrity isn't measured by how you see yourself, Justice. It's measured by how accountable you're willing to be to those you serve. He frowned ever so slightly. Because while you may not see a problem with stepping onto a private jet paid for by someone with active business before your bench, she said, now looking not just at him but to the room, the American people, many of whom will never even fly commercial, see it differently. There it was again, that tone, not furious, not accusatory, just undeniable. The kind of truth that made defense feel like deflection. Alito opened his mouth, but nothing came out, and Alexandria, unbothered, turned to the next page, the next flight, the next donor, the next ruling, because the ride hadn't ended. It had only just taken off. Alexandria didn't pause between sections. She knew the power of rhythm, of keeping the pressure constant. Like a trial lawyer who senses the witness beginning to unravel, she pressed forward. Not to catch Alito off guard, but to make it impossible for him to regain composure before the next revelation hit. She turned another page in her binder. The paper this time was thin, but the content heavy. It was a printed copy of Alito's most recent financial disclosures, publicly available, technically compliant, and yet, as she was about to show, deeply incomplete. Let's talk about the disclosure requirements under the Ethics in Government Act, she said, eyes still on the page. Specifically, the obligation to report gifts, travel, and any reimbursements or hospitality extended in a professional capacity. Alito crossed his arms, saying nothing. She lifted her gaze. Your 2022 report makes no mention of the October 14th dinner you attended in Richmond, the one hosted by the Federal Liberty Foundation at the private residence of energy executive Mark Underhill. He didn't blink, but the air behind him did. One of his aides stopped typing. The other raised an eyebrow almost imperceptibly. According to attendee records, she continued, flipping to the attached spreadsheet, that event included at least 4 individuals representing firms with active cases before the Supreme Court. Your name was listed on the internal guest memo as a distinguished guest of honor. Alito finally spoke, the words slower now. That was a private function. There was no honorarium, no formal speaking role. The invitation was extended personally. AOC nodded slightly. No honorarium, but according to FEC data, the event incurred over $35,000 in costs, including catering, transportation, and security. Costs which the foundation did not absorb alone. They were co-sponsored by a legal advocacy group that filed a brief in Greenpoint v. Rafferty, a case you ruled on less than 24 hours after the dinner. The timing hit harder than any quote could have. 24 hours, one night of fine wine and policy talk. One morning of judicial authority handed down in a ruling that reshaped environmental protections across 4 states. You ruled on that case the very next day, Alexandria said, her voice low and steady. No disclosure, no recusal. For a second, no one moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, a shift. A member of the committee, Republican, seated 2 chairs to the right of the chairman, shifted in his seat. Not a grand gesture, but enough to register. Another member leaned back, face unreadable. The political lines weren't erased, but they were blurred, just slightly. Alito leaned toward the microphone. There is no rule prohibiting private dinners. No, AOC said, voice still calm. There's just the expectation that a justice on the nation's highest court doesn't dine privately with stakeholders on the eve of a decision. That's not about rules. That's about judgment. She let the silence settle before continuing. And what concerns the public, Justice, isn't just what you ruled. It's how close to influence you were willing to sit while doing it. Alito exhaled through his nose but said nothing more. Alexandria reached for the next report. I have 3 more events listed, each with a similar pattern, undisclosed, followed by favorable rulings, and again, no recusal. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had already done something rarer. She had raised the standard. And for the first time, even some of his usual defenders weren't sure they could meet it. The weight of the disclosures hung thick in the chamber. It wasn't just the documents anymore. It was the pattern. Flight logs, dinners, funding trails, judicial outcomes, all mapped, all read into the record. But it wasn't the paper that made the room shift. It was the feeling, the slow, spreading sense that something sacred had been touched without permission, and now the quiet was the only honest sound left. Justice Alito sat slightly more forward in his chair than he had 30 minutes ago. His arms weren't folded now. His eyes flicked to the corner of the room, perhaps seeking a reset, a cue to retreat to safer ground. And that's exactly what he tried to do. I'd like to return the committee's attention to jurisprudential consistency, he said, tone flatter than before, almost mechanical. The majority of my record, which spans decades, reflects sound constitutional application and precedent-based rulings. It's important not to allow isolated optics to distract from a judge's broader contributions to legal clarity. He reached for his printed copy of remarks, flipping the top page over with more emphasis than necessary, as if sheer volume of paper might neutralize what had just been placed before him. But Alexandria wasn't following him back into abstraction. She stayed where she was, leaning slightly forward, fingers resting on the edge of her binder, eyes locked on his with the same steadiness that had carried her through every footnote, every flight log, every uncomfortable truth. Justice Alito, she said quietly, you hold a position that can't be fired. He didn't look up, but his fingers stilled. That's exactly why the truth has to be louder than your title. There it was, no escalation, no sting in her voice, just weight, just clarity, and it landed heavier than any accusation might have. Because it wasn't just said for him, it was said for the record, for the reporters with pens now motionless, for the staffers who'd stopped whispering, for the law students who would study this hearing 10 years from now to understand where the veneer cracked. You speak of optics, she continued, still calm, but optics only become dangerous when they reflect something deeper, something real. When dinners align with decisions, when omissions stack next to outcomes, when the silence around influence grows louder than the law meant to keep it in check, that's not misperception, that's erosion. He moved finally, not to respond, but to reach for the water at his side. His hand wasn't shaking, not exactly, but it wasn't steady either. He poured slowly, too slowly. A drop spilled over the rim and hit the tablecloth like punctuation. Alexandria let the silence breathe. Then she turned a single page in her binder, crisp and deliberate. I'm not questioning your intelligence, Justice. I'm questioning your insulation. Because when no one's allowed to hold power accountable, power forgets what it's for. She paused, letting that truth settle into the wood grain of the hearing room, into the metal nameplates and stone walls that had seen decades of careful avoidance. Her words weren't about scandal. They were about gravity. And the room did feel smaller now, not because the walls had moved, but because for the first time, the title of Supreme Court Justice didn't seem quite big enough to stand between the questions and the consequences. The room had grown so quiet by then that even the smallest motion echoed. Fingers brushing paper, a chair creaking 2 rows back, the faint mechanical hum of a camera adjusting focus. Alexandria knew the moment had arrived. Not the climax, not yet, but the point of no return. The place where speculation ended and something irreversible began. She reached down slowly and withdrew a thin blue folder from the bottom of her binder. It was different from the others, unmarked on the outside except for a discreet stamp in red block letters across the tab. Confidential, internal review only. A few committee members leaned slightly forward without meaning to. A reporter near the back instinctively checked that his audio was still recording. AOC didn't hold it up or announce it with flair. She simply opened the folder, turned to the first page, and placed it flat on the desk in front of her. This, she said calmly, is a memo dated January 23rd, 2022, circulated internally by your chambers. Alito blinked but said nothing. She continued. It references an early draft of your opinion in Klein v. Dobbs, a case challenging state-level abortion restrictions based on coercion claims. This memo predates oral arguments by 6 weeks. Now the energy shifted, not just tension, but a chill of recognition, like the room had felt this kind of moment once before and knew exactly how fast things could fall apart afterward. In the 3rd paragraph, Alexandria said, turning the page, your lead clerk summarizes your view of the plaintiff's argument, and I quote, her narrative is less a legal position than a political tool, crafted to elicit public sympathy, not judicial relief. A rustle moved through the room, more instinctive than voluntary. It wasn't loud, but it spread. One committee member lowered his pen. Another, until now half checked out, straightened and looked directly at Alito. He sat very still. AOC pressed forward. This wasn't public. It wasn't filed. It was never reviewed in open court. And yet, your own internal correspondence shows not only a prejudgment of the plaintiff's claims, but a characterization that borders on contempt. Alito finally spoke, voice flatter than before. Congresswoman, that was an early draft. It was never part of the official record. But it was circulated, she replied. It was read. It shaped discussions within your chambers. And it undermines the core principle of judicial neutrality, because long before testimony was heard, the plaintiff had already been labeled a performance. The words hit harder than her tone suggested, and that made them worse. Behind Alito, one of his aides shuffled a folder, perhaps out of instinct. Another whispered something quickly, too low to catch. But it didn't matter. The committee members weren't looking at them anymore. They were watching him. The judiciary's code of conduct, Alexandria continued, makes clear that even the appearance of bias undermines public trust. And when a sitting Supreme Court justice refers to a plaintiff's argument as a political tool before hearing the evidence, what are we supposed to believe? That the robe erases the bias? That the bench purifies the instinct? Alito didn't reply. AOC turned the final page in the folder and placed it carefully atop the stack. "You don't have to answer that, Justice," she said, "because the memo already did." The silence that followed wasn't just stillness. It was consequence. The kind that lingered. The kind that made every person in the room suddenly aware of how deep the line had just been drawn. And how much further the story still had to go. The weight of the memo hadn't lifted. It hovered in the room like a low ceiling, pressing down on the wood paneling, the polished nameplates, the half-finished notes on every aide's tablet. Alito hadn't moved. His hands rested neatly folded on the table, but the stillness was different now. It didn't read as control. It read as calculation. Alexandria turned to the next document, a single-page printout with a clipped header. Email correspondence, internal clerk network. It wasn't dramatic to look at. There were no bold letters, no confidential stamps, just a clean thread of text between former colleagues. But what it confirmed had the power to undo months of evasion in a single breath. "Justice Alito," she said, tone steady, "I'd like to introduce an email sent by your former clerk, David Kernan, to 2 colleagues on February 8, 2022. The subject line reads, Dobbs draft, Chambers reactions." The body of the email confirms that the memo I just read from was shared with 3 other chambers prior to oral arguments. She glanced up. "Do you dispute that?" Alito's eyes narrowed. "Clerks discuss ideas all the time," he said, louder than before. "That is the nature of judicial deliberation. Drafts, memos, opinions, all of it exists in flux until a final ruling is issued. You're building a conspiracy out of routine procedure." The response hung in the air, too sharp to sound assured, too defensive to land cleanly. Alexandria didn't respond right away. She let the sound of his voice echo just long enough to let it deflate. Then she spoke, softer now, almost a whisper compared to his rise. "Not when they declare verdicts before the trial." A few eyes widened in the press gallery. That wasn't theater. It was something colder. She hadn't accused him of misconduct. She had diagnosed it. And in her delivery there was no triumph. Just fatigue. Just clarity. Alito shifted in his chair. His aide, now visibly rattled, passed a folded slip of paper to another assistant, who took it but didn't move. The energy in the room had tipped again, but not in chaos, in recognition. This wasn't about a misstep anymore. It was about pattern, a thread running from dinners to disclosures, to drafts that no longer looked like harmless preparation, but something far more deliberate. AOC turned back to the email. In the second paragraph, Kernan writes, and I quote, "The justice believes the plaintiff's framing is emotionally loaded and strategically dishonest, and he sees no merit in entertaining it as a good faith legal claim." Her voice didn't change. It didn't need to. She looked back at Alito. That was written before the plaintiff's counsel ever stepped into the chamber, before a single question was asked, before the facts were even read aloud. Alito opened his mouth, but she raised one hand, graceful, calm, not silencing, just pausing. "I know clerks explore theories. I know drafts evolve. But when internal commentary begins to sound like judgment, and when that judgment leaks into written rulings that ignore key evidence, people stop seeing the court as impartial." She closed the email, folded it once, and set it aside. And when that trust breaks, it doesn't just damage a case, it damages the entire institution. No one spoke. Even the chairman remained still. Alito looked down at his notes again, but this time he didn't turn the page. Because whatever defense he'd prepared no longer fit the shape of what was unfolding, and Alexandria hadn't raised her voice once. The air in the room had grown tighter, like it had less space to circulate. The email Alexandria had just read wasn't speculative. It was confirmation. And in a chamber full of people used to hedge language and legal ambiguity, confirmation had a different kind of gravity. Alito hadn't responded. Not really. His earlier sharpness had dulled into silence, and for the first time since the hearing began, his authority felt less like armor and more like burden. Alexandria didn't gloat. She didn't push the moment too hard. Instead, she reached for the copy of the Judicial Code of Conduct placed neatly beneath her notes. A slim, well-worn booklet with corners softened by use. She held it lightly, turning to a marked page with slow care. the kind reserved for texts that still mean something. Canon 3, she said, her voice calm again. It reads, "A judge shall perform the duties of the office fairly, impartially, and diligently. A judge shall avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities." She paused, eyes scanning the room, letting the words hang for a beat before continuing. "Not just impropriety," she repeated, "the appearance of it. Because in your role, Justice, trust isn't a suggestion. It's a currency. And when it's spent too easily, it doesn't get replenished with explanations." Alito sat back slightly, his fingers tapping faintly against the table. He opened his mouth, closed it again. He looked to the chairman, then quickly away. The tap of his ring against the wood had gone from measured to involuntary. The chairman leaned forward, eyes sharper now. He hadn't spoken in some time, letting the exchange play out. But now he seemed to be weighing something deeper. Not just policy, but posture. Not just what had been said, but what hadn't. Alexandria let the moment breathe, then lowered the booklet gently onto the desk. "I'm not suggesting bias is easy to measure," she said. "I'm not even suggesting it always happens on purpose. But when a justice sits down to write an opinion and has already referred to a plaintiff's claim as strategic dishonesty before hearing a single word from the plaintiff themselves, that's not legal diligence. That's breach." She didn't say breach of trust. She didn't need to. The word stood on its own. Alito tried again. "Judges are entitled to form preliminary impressions. The notion that internal dialogue invalidates an entire opinion is—" "Not the notion," she interrupted, still soft, still firm. "The pattern." She looked around the room, not at the chairman or the aides or the aides, but at the rows of staffers, the committee members who hadn't spoken, the ones who had been watching, waiting, wondering if it would all amount to something more than noise. "This isn't just about legal theory," she said, her voice like a blade drawn without haste. "It's about trust. No flash, no flourish, just truth, dropped into the silence like a stone in a still lake. And in that instant, the hearing wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a test of the robe, of the bench, of whether the country's most powerful judges still believed they owed something to the people watching them from the other side of the gavel." There was a stillness after her last words that even Alexandria didn't rush to interrupt. She had no interest in pushing harder than necessary. The truth had already begun to do its work. It was in the weight of her tone, the accumulation of evidence, the careful, unwavering line from contradiction to contradiction. But now came the turn. The pivot, not of facts, but of feeling. She didn't need to land another blow. What she needed was to remind the room what this was really about, and who it was for. She closed her binder slowly and folded her hands in front of her, gaze still steady. But her voice, when she spoke again, shifted. Not soft, not dramatic, just closer, more human. "I want to tell you a story," she said, "that isn't in any memo, or footnote, or public record." The room didn't stir, but it listened differently now. "When I was little," she began, "maybe 7 or 8, my mom used to take me with her sometimes when she worked late. She cleaned houses, offices, whatever job she could get. But once in a while, if she had a contract through the temp agency, she'd get assigned to buildings in Westchester, courthouses." She looked down at her notes for just a second, but she wasn't reading. She was remembering. "There was one night," she said, "when she brought me to a judge's chambers. I remember the room was large, larger than anything I'd ever been in at the time. High ceilings, dark wood, thick carpet that swallowed your footsteps. I didn't want to touch anything. It felt like a museum." She smiled faintly at the memory, but there was no nostalgia in it, only clarity. "My mother cleaned in silence. She always did. She wiped the baseboards, polished the brass on the desk lamp, scraped gum off the underside of a bench like it was sacred. She moved around that room like it meant something. And when I asked her why she worked so hard in a place no one would ever thank her for, she just said, 'Because justice lives here, and justice deserves to be clean.'" There was a long pause, long enough for the words to settle not just in the room, but in people's faces. The kind of pause that didn't feel empty, but full. Then with the same deliberate movement she used to flip court exhibits, Alexandria reached into her wallet. Not a statement, not a photo, just something small and plastic, faded around the corners, slightly cracked along one edge. She held it up, resting it lightly between her fingers. This is her cleaning badge, she said. Issued in 1996. Still has her maiden name on it. She carried it in her pocket every shift. She didn't hand it over. She didn't wave it around. She just let it exist, visibly, undeniably, between the sterile formality of the setting and the very real woman who once scrubbed its floors. My mother scrubbed floors in rooms like this, Alexandria said, her voice even, but close to the edge of something deeper. Believing justice lived in them. Her eyes swept across the room now, not confrontational but searching. She believed the law meant something, that the people who wore the robes were worthy of the rooms she kept clean, that behind the rules and rituals, someone was actually listening. She looked back at Alito. And I'm here today to honor that belief. It wasn't a speech, it wasn't strategy, it was a memory pulled from the ground level of a life spent watching how systems looked from below. And for the first time all morning, the chamber didn't just feel quiet, it felt reverent. The room still held the echo of her mother's story, soft, haunting, unforgettable. Even the reporters who had typed nonstop all morning had paused, their fingers hovering in place as if unsure whether what they had just witnessed was a moment of testimony or a prayer. Alito's eyes had dipped slightly toward the table, not out of concession, but out of something far more vulnerable. Recognition, not defeat, not yet, but a shift in terrain. He no longer sat above it. Alexandria didn't rush the transition. She let the silence stretch just long enough to honor it, then reached for her binder one last time. It was almost empty now. Pages turned, exhibits marked and laid bare. Only one remained. Tucked into the final sleeve, crisp and discreet. She removed it gently, unfolded the trifold page, and held it before her like any other document. But this one wasn't court record or legal opinion. It was something more elusive and more damning. This, she said quietly, is an unpublished itinerary from March 19th, 2023. She didn't wave it, didn't call for spectacle. It confirms your attendance, Justice Alito, at a private fundraising dinner in Alexandria, Virginia, held by the Executive Liberty Fund, a group whose founder filed an amicus brief in Thompson vs. FEEC, a case on which you cast the deciding vote. Alito shifted. A flicker crossed his face, faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to notice. The itinerary shows dinner was held 3 days before oral arguments. The notes list you as seated next to the founder during the main course. And your travel log from Chambers omits any reference to the engagement. She glanced up, her eyes not sharp this time, not cold, just precise. There was no disclosure. A long breath passed. Someone coughed in the back of the chamber. The chairman leaned forward as if about to speak, then stopped himself. He didn't need to interject. Everyone knew what had just happened. AOC didn't press harder. She didn't need to. I'm not a judge, she said quietly. I'm not bound by the robe or its customs, but I represent the people who live with the consequences of the silence that sometimes flows from that bench. She paused and closed the binder with a soft but audible click. Every silence from your bench, she continued, becomes an echo in someone else's life. Now her eyes swept the room again, not for drama, not for applause, but to connect. When a woman loses access to health care because of a ruling built on undeclared bias, that's not theory, it's her body. When a voter finds their polling place closed because precedent was bent around donor influence, that's not academic, it's their democracy. When you share meals with stakeholders and then rule on their cases, the silence after that ruling isn't neutral. It's a thunderclap for every person who no longer believes their story will be heard. She folded the itinerary once neatly and returned it to the binder. No crescendo, no flourish, just truth, delivered with the weight of everything that came before. Justice Alito, she said, I don't need you to answer me. Because I wasn't asking a question, I was stating a record. He didn't respond, couldn't. And in the quiet that followed, for the first time that morning, the power didn't belong to the title or the gavel or the robe. It belonged to the witness, the woman who never raised her voice, yet had made the entire room hear her. And the strike, when it landed, left no marks. Just the sound of trust breaking open. The weight of the final document still hovered in the room like a low-pressure system. Nothing moved. No shuffle of papers, no whispered sidebar between aides. Even the distant hum of hallway reporters had faded, as if the moment demanded stillness from the building itself. Justice Samuel Alito stared at the now-closed binder across from him, not with anger, not even disbelief, but something far more fragile. Exposure. The kind that doesn't wound, but empties. He adjusted his chair slightly, then pushed back from the table with a slow, deliberate motion. The creak of the wooden legs on the marble floor seemed louder than it should have been, like a hinge giving out in an old cathedral. "I won't continue under these conditions," he said. His voice, once measured and elevated, now rang hollow, not because it lacked power, but because it no longer echoed off reverence. It just fell. No one interrupted him. The chairman didn't lean forward. No aides reached for talking points. Alito stood, gathered his documents, too neatly, as if control could be reclaimed with corners squared, and began the slow walk down the center aisle of the hearing room. No cameras followed. No questions shouted after him. Not because they weren't allowed, but because no one wanted to fill the silence with spectacle. The real story had already been told, and he was no longer its author. The door at the end of the chamber opened, just slightly, and then closed behind him with a soft click. And still, the room remained quiet. Alexandria sat motionless for a few seconds more, not looking at the press gallery, not meeting the eyes of her fellow committee members. She didn't reach for her notes. She didn't turn to whisper with her staff. She just breathed, a single breath in, like someone who had been holding it for hours without realizing. Then out, slow and even, like she was letting go of something she never meant to carry in the first place. She didn't smile. There was nothing victorious in her posture, because it hadn't been about winning. It had been about naming what needed to be named. She looked down at the binder now closed before her, quiet, orderly, finished. Not because the fight was over, but because the record had been set. A record of contradiction, of silence, of influence masked as neutrality, but also a record of something else, of a daughter honoring her mother, of truth standing taller than title, of courage without volume. Across the aisle, a Republican staffer sat frozen, their fingers poised over the keyboard but unmoving, not out of confusion, but reflection. The chairman finally leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, his face unreadable. No gavel came down. No formal recess was called. Just breath and consequence. Outside the room, reporters would scramble to shape the moment. Headlines would be drafted, tweets fired off in waves. But none of that noise had reached here yet. Here in this quiet chamber, the sound that remained wasn't Alito's retreat. It was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez finally sitting back in her chair. Binder closed, head upright, voice steady, even in silence. And for those watching, really watching, that was the loudest moment of all. 2 days after the hearing, the headlines were still burning like brush fire. Clips from the moment Justice Alito stood and walked out had looped endlessly on television and across social media. There were opinion pieces, think tank statements, memes, even merchandise. But none of it really touched what it felt like. Not the tension in the air before the binder closed. Not the breath Alexandria took before her final words. Not the silence after he left. Now, far from the Capitol, she sat in her district office. No makeup, no congressional seal behind her. Just a small camera, a desk she'd used 100 times before, and a city humming outside the window like it always did. She looked into the lens, not rehearsed, not performative, just present. "You might have seen that hearing," she said quietly, "or maybe just the clip." She let it sit there. Not every viewer had watched the whole thing, and she knew it. In the age of edits and echoes, people often only caught the sharpest moments, like the door clicking shut after Alito left. But what she needed to say now wasn't about the ending. It wasn't about making someone walk out, she said, or going viral, or turning a hearing into a spectacle. Her voice didn't rise, it never needed to. It was about accountability and about memory. She leaned forward slightly, folding her hands, not as a gesture, but as instinct. I come from a place where people are told justice is blind, but learn pretty quickly it can also look away. I watched my mother clean courtrooms, believing those rooms held something sacred. I still believe they can, but belief doesn't survive on slogans, it survives on truth. Even when the truth makes people uncomfortable. Especially then. Outside, a car alarm chirped faintly, life continuing. Inside, the camera kept rolling. What happened in that room wasn't just about me. It was about all the people who don't get to walk into a hearing room with a binder, who don't get to ask the questions, who never hear their names in the official record. She paused, her hands tightening just slightly. I didn't speak because I had power. I spoke because I remembered what it felt like not to have any. And I wanted them, the ones watching from living rooms and late shifts in public libraries, to see that truth can still be spoken in places that try to bury it. Her voice cracked, just a little. Not from weakness, but from remembering too much at once. So if you saw that clip, I hope you saw more than a confrontation. I hope you saw that it's still possible to ask hard questions, even when the answers are designed to make you quit. She looked down, then back up, eyes clear, shoulders square. And I hope you remember that silence from power is not peace, it's just delay. And we don't have time to wait anymore. The camera held on her for a second longer. No music, no outro, just truth, quietly spoken, and once again, impossible to ignore. The desk in front of her was scratched in a dozen small places, memories from staplers slammed, phones dropped, restless fingers tapping during late-night policy meetings. It wasn't made for cameras. It wasn't built for perfect backdrops. But in this moment, that made it even more right. This desk was real. This story was real. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had no intention of wrapping it in polished sound bites. She leaned slightly closer to the lens, the raw afternoon light softening the edges of her face. This wasn't about a takedown, she said. It was about fairness, and whether power thinks it owes us any answers. Her voice didn't waver, but it did deepen, as though she were speaking less to the camera and more to a memory, or maybe to a younger version of herself, the one who used to stand outside closed doors, unsure if she'd ever be allowed in. You don't walk into a room like that hoping to be liked, she continued. You walk in hoping to be heard. And if you're lucky, if you do it right, you speak for someone who's never even been in the room. She paused, then reached into her wallet, slowly, deliberately. Not for dramatics, but with the care of someone handling something sacred. From one of the inner pockets, she pulled out a small plastic card, edges frayed from time. The kind of ID badge clipped to a belt or lanyard. White background, blurry photo. Laminate faded to yellow at the corners. She held it up to the camera. Not long, just enough. This was my mom's. She used to clean judges' chambers in Westchester, places like the one where Alito used to sit. Her fingers curled gently around the badge. She didn't have a law degree. She didn't wear a robe. But she believed those rooms stood for something, that maybe justice really did live there. She looked down at the card for a moment before setting it on the desk beside her notes. It didn't need to be explained further. The meaning had already arrived. Dignity doesn't come with a title, she said quietly. It comes with choices. And yesterday, someone made a choice to walk away from questions instead of answer them. That's not justice. That's not courage. That's not what our country deserves. She leaned back in her chair. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with weight, with a clarity that didn't ask for applause. I don't know what happens next, she admitted. I don't control consequences, but I do know what accountability sounds like. And it doesn't whisper. Her eyes met the lens again, tired but clear. So ask yourself the real question, she said. Not what side you're on, not who you like. Ask what kind of answers we deserve. And who's still brave enough to ask the questions? She reached forward and turned off the camera herself. No slogan, no fade out. Just a room, a badge, and a woman who remembered where she came from, and made sure the world did too. The room had gone quiet again, not from tension this time, but from clarity. AOC sat still for a moment longer, letting the silence stretch, not to fill space, but to give the words room to land. Her fingers lightly tapped the edge of her mother's badge on the desk, like punctuation for everything that had just been said. She looked up once more, directly into the camera. The tone was steady, not rehearsed, not softened, just true. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to care. She leaned forward slightly. Read more, ask more, expect more. Don't take the robes and titles at face value. Look underneath. Look for the patterns. Because if we don't pay attention, they'll rewrite the rules while we're busy playing by them. She took a quiet breath, her voice neither rising nor falling, just cutting through. Power isn't permanent, but the truth, that stays. There was no backdrop behind her now. No seal, no flag, just plain walls, a desk, the camera. A woman who had asked her questions and refused to let silence be the final answer. She nodded once, not as a farewell, but as an affirmation, not of victory, but of resolve. Then just before the screen faded, she said one last thing. The line wasn't loud. It wasn't polished. It just rang true. You don't need to yell to shake the room, she said softly. You just need to be right. The screen faded to black. A few soft piano notes followed. And for anyone still watching, still listening, that was the moment they felt the ground shift. This story isn't just about a confrontation in a hearing room. It's about what happens when someone dares to speak truth to power with clarity, calm, and conviction. AOC didn't raise her voice. She raised the bar. In doing so, she reminded us that accountability isn't a spectacle, it's a service. And dignity doesn't come from status, but from the choices we make when the world is watching, and especially when it isn't. Justice isn't just a word carved above a courtroom door. It's something we must insist on, even when those in power hope we'll forget. What about you? Have you ever had to speak up when staying quiet would have been easier? We'd love to hear your story. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.